I would like to acknowledge that this video is being filmed on the traditional lands of the Wurrundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people who may be watching this video today. Hi everyone, my name is Steph, this is the Novelty Corner, and today I have some forced proximity romance recommendations for you. Forced proximity is a very common trope in romance books and is obviously where the two protagonists are forced to spend a significant amount of time together, and that usually has an impact on the way that their romantic relationship progresses. I am going to be talking about 5 books. One of them is a young adult title that I absolutely adore and could not include in this list because it is a contemporary romance, just a young adult one, and then 4 adult romance titles. The first book that I want to mention, I'll start off with the YA title, is Starry Eyes by Jen Bennett, which is one of my all-time absolute favourite YA books. This is a young adult contemporary romance between Zori and Lennon, who were best friends but became enemies after something happened at last year's homecoming dance. And they've known each other for years. Their parents have businesses next door to each other. They were basically inseparable, and then this split happened. And then they end up on the same camping trip with a group of friends. And when something goes wrong on this camping trip, Zori and Lennon are left stranded together. They decide to continue the rest of the trip together. So this is the forced proximity, they're left alone. They really have to confront what happened to them, and they have to address it, and they have to address their feelings toward one another. It is just such a gorgeous book. I usually reread it once a year. Normally it's the first book I reread each year, but I haven't reread it yet. And I'm going to save it for when I just want that comforting book that I know I will enjoy. If you haven't read it, it is highly worth checking out. My second recommendation is To Be Alone With You by Jodie Slaughter. This is a novella-length contemporary romance story. We find out that 10 years ago, Naomi confessed her attraction to a man named Ira, who is an artist and was a student of her mother. At the time, he basically turned down her advances because of the age gap, because there's a 10-year age gap between them. And now we're in the present day, and Naomi is in desperate need of a break and a retreat, and so her mother organizes for her to stay at a beautiful guest house in a Californian desert that just happens to be owned by Ira. Everything's going great. They don't really interact with each other for the first couple of days, but then the full impact of the pandemic hits them, and they realize that for the time being, they're going to be stuck together. And their relationship goes from there. It is an absolutely gorgeous story. Obviously, if reading COVID-19 pandemic stories is not something for you, maybe skip this one. But I didn't find it particularly triggering, and I absolutely adored both characters, the setting. There's lots of references made to art and art making. Ira is a sculptor, and it is just such a gorgeous book. Also, has a truly beautiful cover. The next book on my list is Hotter Than Ever by Elle Kennedy. This is book 9 in the Out of Uniform series, but you don't have to have read anything else around it because I read this one without reading any of them. It is an MMF polyamorous contemporary romance story. We open the book with Claire, who is about to get married only to be left at the altar by her fiance. And she's found by her fiance's brother Dylan, who she doesn't have a very good relationship with. They don't get along, but he finds her and he can't leave her there. He recognizes that despite the fact that he doesn't like Claire, he doesn't really condone what his brother did. And she just wants to get out of there. She doesn't want to see anyone. She doesn't want to face her family or her friends. And Dylan ends up taking her back to his place. And it's such a weird situation for them that they really don't know how to process the fact that he's helping her. And then Dylan realizes that his new roommate Aiden is going to be coming home. Now, Dylan and Aiden are both in the military, and they have sort of this friends with benefits relationship, and Claire unintentionally sees them one night. So the story is really about how the three of them actually evolve into a relationship with each other. But the funniest scene and the forced proximity scene that really made me want to include this book in this video is that at one point Aiden gets so sick of the way that Claire and Dylan won't communicate with each other that he tricks them into going into his room, and then he locks and bars the door and he leaves. And he says he'll be back in an hour once they've sorted out their issues and they've actually talked about their issues. It was a really fantastic scene. It really showed that Aiden is probably the most emotionally aware of all 3 of them, and that he knew that he had to let them sort it out before the relationship could go any further. So that's why I included it in this scene, because it was only a short forced proximity scene, but it was very highly effective in the way that it was used within the book. The next book on my list is Saint by Sierra Simone, which is the third book in the Priest series, and it is an contemporary romance. We have Aidan Bell, who is one of the Bell brothers, and he basically ran away from his life one night after the voices in his head got too much for him, and he left his family, he left his partner Elijah, and he joined a monastery and became a monk. And the monastery that he joined is fantastic. There are some really great characters in there that we meet, and they brew beer. He's been there for a while, and then Elijah comes to visit him, and really Elijah is looking for some closure because he's moving on with his life. He has a new partner, and he's just trying to put all of this behind him. Elijah's visit really prompts Aidan to think about whether or not this monastery is the right one for him, and in fact he wants something harsher and something more solitary, and so he organizes to travel around to some different monasteries in Europe and see if he can find a place that he thinks is going to be of benefit to him. And so he goes on this trip under the guise of visiting other monasteries that brew beer to look at their setups and their production, and to bring back that information to his home monastery, and then consider whether or not he's going to make the move. And Elijah hears about it and talks his way into also going on this trip because he is a journalist, and the publication that he writes for would be interested in a story about the monks that brew beer, because he hadn't realized that that was a thing. And the story is really this forced proximity situation of them having to travel together, having yet to confront their feelings and their past and potentially their future. I really love this series. I think Sierra Simone does some really interesting things. This was very different to the first two books in the series, and I like that we also got to travel in the story as well, because it created some really unique situations for the two of them to be alone, even though they've got all of these issues between them. And then my final recommendation is Hearts in Darkness by Laura Kay. This is another contemporary romance story, and it is about two strangers who are in an elevator together, and then the power goes out and the lights go out, and they haven't really acknowledged each other. They haven't really looked at each other, so they don't really know what the other person looks like, but they're stuck in this elevator for 4 hours, and they're their only source of comfort. So despite the fact that they've never met, McKenna and Caden have to comfort one another, and they really forge this connection while stuck together that then follows them once they're out. And they both have their own issues to deal with. This is a duology, so I'd recommend reading both stories, and there's a lot of emotional highs and lows in their story, but it starts with this very intense forced proximity scene, and it is gorgeous. So those are my recommendations. In the comments below, I would love to know if you have a favorite forced proximity romance, or if you've read any of these ones. Otherwise, feel free to leave a building emoji if you want to let me know that you're here but you don't want to leave a comment. I hope that wherever you're in the world, you're staying safe and healthy, and I'll see you in my next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye everyone.